First off, we will hear from Richard E. Turley, Jr., who for a number of years was assistant church historian of the LDS Church, and has taken in the last little while a new challenge, shall we say, and he is the managing director of Church Public Affairs. Is that distinguished from private affairs, Rick, or I assume that's another department altogether? We're friends, so he lets me get away with stuff like that. At least I hope he lets me get away with stuff like that. He grew up in my wife's ward, in the ward we live in now. So we've known Rick for a long time, and he's a wonderful man, and has...
I get a call after.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to say, in his role as managing director of public affairs, he gets phone calls at any hour, and he warned me that this could happen. So, you know, when you're called in that position, you take the calls that come. So we'll have to work around Rick as best we can. But he, of course, is the author or editor of many volumes. I'll just mention a couple here. Most of you are probably aware, I need to work this out a little better. Most of you are aware of the landmark volume on the Mountain Meadows Massacre that he and Glenn Leonard and unfortunately the late Ronald Walker, not too long ago Ron passed away, but they did some years ago, and this has been a very important book in the body of literature on that darkest of chapters in our history. Highly recommend this book, and I think we have probably some that are signed by all three authors. Rick also did Victims, the LDS Church, and the Mark Hoffman case. Those are two of his better known, but he's done lots and lots of other books. I won't take the time to go into the whole bibliography, but we wish Rick well in his new assignment, relatively new assignment as Managing Director of Public Affairs. And then next up will be Janiece Johnson, who is a visiting professor of religion at BYU, Idaho, and is going to be at the Maxwell Institute later this year. Is that right, Janiece?
In the fall.
In the fall. And we just, unfortunately, only have one copy of her book, Give It All Up and Follow Your Lord, male. Excuse me, she'll forgive me for that, I hope. Mormon female, that's kind of combining Mormon and male together. Mormon female religiosity, 1831 to 1843. And so that won't take much signing time, will it, Janiece? Unfortunately, that's the last one we have. And then LaJean Purcell Carruth is historian for the Church History Library here in Salt Lake. She's a transcriber of 19th and early 20th century documents written in Pittman, Taylor, and Pernin. Is that right? Is that how you say it?
I think so.
Pernin shorthands. I was going to bring some of my handwriting to see if she could decipher it, but I think that it would test her limits. So, but she's quite accomplished in this field. If anyone wants to know about old shorthand and is having trouble cracking them or have questions about them, she's the name that pops up always. And she's been involved in many projects where, including the Wilford Woodruff journals and the Mountain Meadows documents, many others, too numerous to mention. But she is the unquestioned authority in our realm here, and probably on a much higher scale as well. So we're very pleased to to have each of these distinguished authors with us and historians. So maybe we're, yeah? Just gonna turn the time over to you. Are you able to, okay.
Thank you.
I made up lots of stuff about you. I hope that's okay. Some of it was good. So we'll start it and do it in that order that I mentioned, and I'll get these out of your way. So Richard E. Turley, leave those. So you want to just do that? Put that on your. Test it and see how that goes.
Testing, 1, 2, can you hear me?
Do we need to do it a little bit closer? That didn't sound very loud. Are you hearing back there, Chris? Let's try that, see if that helps at all.
Hello? Okay.
Is that better?
Great. I'd like to begin by talking about how this project began. About a decade and a half ago, Ronald W. Walker, Glenn M. Leonard, and I were deep into working on the volume that eventually became Massacre at Mountain Meadows. And as is traditional in academic research, we did a study of the literature, found out what the fundamental sources were that had already been used by scholars, and we began to try to find those fundamental sources and gather them for our own research. We became aware that there were certain standard sources that all the people who had done primary research seemed to cite. One of those primary sources was the transcripts of the trials of John D. Lee. And there were other sources like John D. Lee's Mormonism Unveiled, his memoir that was posthumously published by his lawyer. We began to rely on these sources, and the more we relied upon them, the more questions we had in our minds about them. I am a stickler for evidence. People who work with me will certify that I generally like to peel the onion all the way down to the core. And the reason I do that is because I've found lots of challenges over the years. For example, there is a set of materials that were described as the journal of one of John D. Lee's wives that people would cite in research about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And I found that there was a typescript of this floating around that people were using. And in taking that journal and using it, you wouldn't notice something that we found when we sent a researcher down to the Huntington Library where the original was. The typescript says that, for example, that John D. Lee did a certain something related to the massacre. And if you see only the typescript, it seems plausible on its face. But when you see the original, what you realize is that the typescript ignores that you have this line about him, and then at the bottom of the page, where there's going to be really key information about what he did, someone has taken a knife and they have trimmed off that line of text and thrown it away. So if you didn't look at the original, you wouldn't know that somebody had monkeyed with the text and deliberately hidden information about what he was doing. So having experiences like that, our goal was to keep peeling back the sources until we could get to the originals of everything. When it came to the transcripts of the trials of John D. Lee, we began to discover that there were challenges because we had two different transcripts, and you would think that transcripts of a trial would have been produced near the time of the trial and that they would be pretty accurate because they were done by court reporters and stenographers and so forth. So we were surprised in comparing two of these transcripts to find that they were different. And the more we pressed, the more we came to recognize that, in fact, these two transcripts were created years after the trials, and they were created with specific motivations in mind, not just to report the trials for legal purposes. And so we then began to say, well, where can we peel this onion back any further? And we discovered that there were shorthand notebooks, both at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, and others in the Church History Library, that represented an even earlier version of what we had. So to make a long story short, we decided that we needed to create a new set of transcripts of John D. Lee's trials, and I was surprised to learn that somebody hadn't already gathered all of the legal documents pertaining to John D. Lee and the other 8 people indicted for the massacre. So we began this big sweep to try to get all of those documents and everything else related to the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Ultimately, we collected over 50 linear feet of files to work on our book. And in the process of peeling back the layers of the onion for the trial transcripts, we discovered that there were massive differences at times between what you found in the shorthand and what you found in the transcripts. Now, how did we know that? Because we had somebody who could read the shorthand, and that was LaJean Purcell Carruth. I became aware of LaJean's talents when I was an undergraduate at BYU. I was working on a university scholars project that required me to transcribe a journal of one of my ancestors, and it had shorthand in it, or what appeared to me to be shorthand. And so I talked to my advisor, who at the time was former assistant church historian James B. Allen, who was then the chairman of the history department at BYU. And becoming aware of LaJean, I sent her this shorthand from my ancestor's journal and asked if she could read it. So that's how I first became aware of her back in the early 1980s. So we invited LaJean to take the underlying notebooks and to create an entirely new transcription of the trials based on the contemporaneous shorthand, which would be the closest that we could get to an actual recording of the voices at the trial. Janiece Johnson came onto our Massacre at Mountain Meadows project early. She worked first with Ron Walker, and I'll let her tell that story. But ultimately, I approached Janiece and asked if she would become part of this project of gathering together the legal papers. Now, there's a certain something about this topic of the Mountain Meadows Massacre that leads you at first to think you can master it very, very quickly. And then after a while, you recognize that, in fact, it's so difficult that it takes a much longer period of time. I see Barbara Jones-Brown sitting over here, for example. Barbara came on as an editor, and for the volume of Massacre at Mountain Meadows, and at the time she came aboard, she had just learned that she was expecting a child, and she wasn't legally obligated to tell me that, but she thought, in the interest of full disclosure, she would tell me that story. And what did I say to you, Barbara?
You said, when's the baby due? I said, May, and you said, oh, no problem, we'll be done in April.
What year was that?
2 years before my daughter, 2 years before we actually finished, so my daughter was 2 by the time we...
So, that's the way Mountain Meadows things happen to be. So when I invited LaJean and Janiece to work on what eventually became these 2 volumes that you see, plus we have a companion website, mountainmeadowsmassacre.org. Did I get that right, Ben? Which has 3,500 more pages of material on it. So altogether, 4,500 pages of material relating to the initial investigations and indictments, and then the trials and aftermath of the legal cases, the 9 legal cases against John D. Lee and those who were named as co-conspirators in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So it turned out to be a massive amount of material. This project went on dramatically longer than we ever anticipated. And we're grateful that we've finally arrived at the day when it's published and it's in our hands and in your hands and can be used by scholars who are interested in getting to primary sources and figuring out exactly what happened under the circumstances. The volumes are divided up according to subject matter, and I'll let my co-editors just describe how it's divided up. But that's the genesis of the case. I want to give you another example of why it's important to go back to primary sources. One of the other standard works for people who are doing research on the Mountain Meadows Massacre is Mormonism Unveiled, which is the posthumously published biography or autobiography of John D. Lee. We assumed initially that it truly was an autobiography, that this was something that he penned, and that he simply gave it to his lawyer who posthumously published it for him. In the process of doing research, we came across letters again at the Huntington Library that showed us that very, very late in his life, not long before his execution, his lawyer, to whom he had promised the royalties as partial payment for his legal fees, was writing to him and saying, thank you for your manuscript of your life, but it doesn't even come up to your arrival in the territory of Utah. So he said, it doesn't have anything about Mountain Meadows or these other Utah War, anything else interesting about that. So then the lawyer says to him, send me your journals and other material and I'll see what I can do with it. Well, if you read Mormonism Unveiled, the published version, it has places in it where it says, Brigham Young gathered up all my journals and destroyed them. So if you take it at face value, you think that John D. Lee's journals did not survive and that this was written by John D. Lee himself. Well, John D. Lee sends letters to family and says, gather up my journals, we're going to give them to my lawyer. And in fact, we know the lawyer got them because later on, members of his family donate them, some of them, to the Huntington Library. So what you see in the published version, Brigham Young gathered up all my journals and destroyed them, doesn't comport with the evidence, which shows that in fact John D. Lee gathered them to give to the lawyer so he could use them to help build his book on John D. Lee for sale for his personal profit. Those kinds of thorny problems exist throughout the Mountain Meadows Massacre saga. Trying to find evidence about the massacre that's accurate and dependable is very, very difficult. You have to comb over a vast amount of material. As I said, we have over 50 linear feet of files. And then you have to make sense of what are often contradictory sources. So if you like, million-piece jigsaw puzzle, this is a subject that you ought to delve into. But recognize in advance, it's a very, very tricky subject. It's tricky because it's a major, horrific crime that occurred, and many of those people who participated in it, in fact, virtually all the people who participated in it, tried to cover it up one way or another at different times in their lives. Some told stories that varied over the course of their lifetimes. So it's a matter of trying to take a lot of lies, doctored evidence, and a vast amount of material that isn't what appears to be on its face, and combing through it in order to find the answers to all of the questions that you naturally come to as an author or editor who's pulling all of this together. In putting all of this together, these two volumes, Massacre at Mountain Meadows and other projects on which we're working, including the promised sequel to Massacre at Mountain Meadows that's mentioned in the preface, there have been a lot of people who have played a role, and some of them are here tonight. If you played a role, would you stand up in any of those projects I talked about? So you can see, we have people here who played a role. Ben, you played a role in that? So this is a team lift. These kinds of projects do not come easily. These are not one-person or two-person or even three-person projects. These are team projects that require an enormous amount of effort, a lot of resources, and collectively decades of effort on the part of the team to be able to provide what we hope will be for future generations standard works that can be relied upon, because we've gone to enormous efforts to make them clear and concise and complete and accurate. I think that's all I'll say at this point, and I'll leave it to my co-editors here, and then at the end we're happy to take questions. I'll trade you.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Okay. I wanted to start out tonight, and forgive me perhaps for getting a little personal, but I have spent more than a decade of my life on Mountain Meadows, and that was something I never intended. But when I was first hired, I had just finished a master's degree at BYU in history, and I was heading to Vanderbilt to go to divinity school the following fall, and I had taken a little bit longer with my master's degree and needed a job. And I interviewed with Ron Walker to be his research assistant, and he told me that we were going to work on Brigham Young and the Indians, which didn't particularly move me, but I needed a job. And then we had a first interview, and then he called me in for what I thought was a second interview. And he said, now I'm going to tell you for real what we're working on, and we're working on Mountain Meadows Massacre. And you have the job if you want the job. But do you want the job? And this was a critical question, and I have questioned my response in the years that have followed from that. But the job was supposed to last for 4 to 5 months, as a whole host of researchers came together to work on this book, which became Massacre at Mountain Meadows. And after 4 or 5 months, we were nowhere near, just anywhere near a completion date. And I, trying to be prepared, had lined up another job working for church historic sites, because I needed a job until the time I was going off to Vanderbilt. But I felt really strongly that I was not done with Mountain Meadows. And Ron Walker said, well, I'm going to have to replace you. You can either do try and split your time between these 2 projects, or you can give all of your effort to one project. And I'm going to have to replace you in a few months anyway. So I think you should probably just spend your time where you had committed yourself, working for church historic sites. And I was really angry with him at the time, because I felt really strongly that I wasn't done with Mountain Meadows. Fast forward a couple years later, after going to divinity school, and I got a call from Rick one day, actually through Jack Welch, talking to me about this project. And as we began, our purpose was to publish the trials, John D. Lee's 2 trials. And as Rick has told us, we thought this would be, we knew it wasn't simple. We knew that at this point, they had already done a considerable amount of work, and we knew that the different accounts did not line up, and we needed to figure out the differences between the different shorthand and transcript accounts of the trials. But we really had no idea what lay ahead. After about a year, I remember going to Rick and saying, if this is going to be done in any reasonable timeline, we need a lot more people working on this. And bit by bit, we gathered together a team to work on this. When Rick talks about the 51 linear feet of documents that have been produced by this project, that actually is, I would say, a considerable underestimate, because we also have thousands of digital documents that every time that I would go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., I would come back with thousands of documents. Right around this time was the first time the National Archives allowed people to bring in digital cameras. The first time I went, I had to make photocopies of every document I wanted to keep. The second time I went, I could take digital photographs. And we were able to amass so many more documents and really begin to understand just how widespread this project was. In our 2 volumes, we had to be narrow. As this was growing exponentially, we had to decide to be very narrow with our chosen scope. And so our scope was limited to official legal actions. Of course, always planning that Rick and Barbara were working on a second narrative volume to follow up Massacre at Mountain Meadows. So we focused and fine-tuned the scope of our project on just those official legal actions. This history goes from 1857, that ill-fated day in September of 1857. The last indictment is not dropped until February of 1896. So we have almost 40 years of legal history. Some of the indictments will actually never be dropped, but the last indictment to be dropped is John M. Higbee's indictment. It may be March of 1896, but just after Utah statehood. And so we have almost 40 years of legal history. And all of this is consistently intertwined with all of the tension between federal appointees, territorial appointees, and the Mormon Church. Mountain Meadows, the prosecution for Mountain Meadows, the massacre itself, but also the prosecution for Mountain Meadows, is never just about the prosecution itself. it is never just about finding those who are guilty of this crime. There are always other considerations that are affecting what's going on or what's not going on, and many times it's what's not happening, that always play into what happens with Mountain Meadows. John D. Lee, the first trial we have is in 1875. John D. Lee had been arrested in November of 1874. William Dame was arrested shortly thereafter. Dame was waiting for them. Lee was hiding in a chicken coop, running on the run. And they, with the grand jury indictments, there were 9 indictments. Some of them were Samuel Jukes. He was not at the massacre. We're not still entirely sure why he was indicted. But we have 9 individuals who are indicted with individual indictments in September of 1874. Lee and Dame are the main focus initially. Isaac Haight would also be a focus, but he is on the run very quickly. And initially, Lee is preparing himself to turn state's evidence. He presents himself, he presents his testimony, and then they decide he did not give anything up to pin the massacre on general church leaders, and they decide to turn around, and rather than trying William Dame first, they turn around and try Lee first. But this, of course, is not going to be an easy take, and we have 3,800 pages of trial testimony, of opening and closing arguments and trial testimony that demonstrate to us just how complex these 2 trials are. The first, volume 1, we have initial investigations and leading up to the indictments. There is an individual chapter on each individual as they were indicted and any legal proceedings that came forth from that. 3 of them were arrested for significant periods of their life. Sometimes they had bail, sometimes they didn't. Others were on the run for the rest of their lives. And then the second half, the second volume, we have the official, the trials and everything leading up to the trials, and then all of those trial transcripts, which we would love to include in one of the published volumes, but it's 3,800 pages is a bit much for any publisher to take on. But we believe that our effort here has been to collect, to try and be comprehensive. We recognize that, and we know there are some documents that we have heard about that we were never able to locate. But our effort is to locate all of those official legal actions. For myself, this spurned on part of my dissertation also became on Mountain Meadows, and what these legal actions tell us about how the popular narrative of the massacre was told, and how that the interdependent relationship between that and the legal actions. And there are many, many, many stories to be told here. There are always lots of different conflicts and really quite a lot of intrigue. But it is really lovely to see it in print, and I think I will leave there and turn the time over to LaJean.
In the summer of 2001, I was employed very part-time by the Church History Department transcribing Pittman shorthand documents. And my then 14-year-old daughter was a volunteer transcribing items written in the Deseret alphabet, which I had learned at 11, and which directly led to my Pittman career. One day we were at the Church History Library, and Steve Sorensen was showing a good time, and he pulled up a book and said, "Here, read this, will you please? It was Marion Shelton's journal. A school teacher who moved to Harmony, where John D. Lee lived, shortly after the massacre, so he was totally innocent. And my daughter read the page, and Steve immediately asked her to transcribe the whole, which was written in longhand and Deseret and in Pitman. And I went home and said, they're working on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. I never dreamed didn't occur to me that it would affect my whole life. While I am on Shelton, I will tell you my favorite bit of humor from the whole. He wrote, as I said, in longhand, and in Pitman shorthand, and in Deseret. So one day, he was about 58, he was writing in longhand. Then he wrote that a Massa Lyman and George A. Smith came to town and stayed with John D. Lee. And the next two lines were in shorthand, and he went back to longhand. Anybody curious? What he said was, they brought several girls with them, and the weather's been very breezy lately. I am convinced he was teasing us. He knew he had set up a situation where anybody would want to know what he'd said. He did the similar thing later on in the book. Well, several months later, I received a phone call, I live in Logan, that Josiah Rogerson's shorthand notes and transcript were being delivered to me. This was in 2002. I've been working on the massacre since. Not full time, thank goodness. For many years it was my main employment. I was told to look for the testimony of Annie Hogue, the only female witness. Rogerson did not transcribe his shorthand for her testimony. I can understand why. She spoke fast. I can tell you who speaks fast and who doesn't from a look at the shorthand. John Taylor and Orson Pratt, they spoke nice and slow, because I can read their shorthand. The shorthand writer had a minuscule amount of time to write more neatly. Well, the lawyers complained about Annie Hogue speaking. She spoke so fast they couldn't understand her. And the shorthand was a mess, but I worked on it and returned to it many, many, many times later. And then I was given no instructions. So I had gone to the library and found out that Klingensmith was an important witness and began comparing the shorthand and transcript for Klingensmith's testimony. It was immediately eye-opening. Rogerson, as he transcribed, changed things. He put in no's, nots. He took them out. He put in words. He put in whole passages. He deleted whole passages. He changed names. He changed numbers. He changed numbers written as digits. A couple places he wrote hate out in shorthand. He wrote it above it in longhand and then omitted it from the transcript. I told my teenage children as this moved along that if we were in a place and I had to tell them somebody was lying and couldn't say it out loud, I'll just say casually, you know, he reminds me of Rogerson. I complained about Rogerson so much when we found out that George Watt did the same in the General Discourses. Janiece asked me one day, how come you're so mad at Rogerson and not at Watt? And I said, Rogerson has put me through years of horror and blood, and Watt invites me into the sacred. But the Journal of Discourses went through the same rewriting. Not quite to the extent, but the same rewriting. Those of you who have copies, if you will turn to page 730 in volume 2, this is my favorite page in the book. We had 2 sets of shorthand, 2 transcripts. Assumption A, shorthand 1 became transcript 1, shorthand 2 became transcript 2. If you can see this book, it's got arrows all over the place. This is the truth that we found out. I'd like to briefly introduce the 4 main characters in the trial, shorthand and transcription saga. The first we've met, Josiah Rogerson. He wrote letters that we have. You cannot believe everything he said. For some of what he said, there's evidence. For some of it, there isn't. He wrote that he was requested by the church to move to Beaver and record John D. Lee's first trial in shorthand. He recorded the first trial in shorthand. We have only one legal plea from the second trial. If we didn't have that, I would insist that he didn't record the second trial. Where he got his transcript for the second trial, I will mention in a minute. In the early 1880s, he transcribed his own shorthand for the church. He said he'd been instructed by Brigham Young to transcribe this. And he did it with a great deal of creativity. In the matrix of the trials online, the Rogerson shorthand is RS and the Rogerson transcript is RT. He repeatedly wrote letters to the First Presidency saying how accurate his transcripts were. You gonna lie? I have no fond feelings for Josiah Rogerson. Sorry, I'm still forgiving that one. Adam Patterson is the second one. He was the official court reporter. Rogerson claimed he was also official, but there's no evidence to back that one up. Janiece and I have argued over that for years. I claimed he wasn't. It could go either way. Adam Patterson was the official court reporter, and he recorded both trials in shorthand. A few of his notebooks are lost, but most of them are extant and are at the Huntington Library in California. Patterson was ordered by the court to transcribe. Lee had two trials. The first one had a hung jury. And if you read the transcripts, you quickly find that the prosecutor in the first trial, Gorham Baskin, wasn't after John D. Lee. He was after the Mormon Church. He was using this trial as a bully pulpit to get at the Mormon Church. In his closing argument, he talks about that bogus prophet of God, Brigham Young. When you've got Mormons on the jury and you're trying to get them to convict, I mean, not a very good legal attempt. The second trial, a new prosecutor said he was going to try John D. Lee. Well, who'd you try at a murder trial? Try the person that's on trial for the murder. Patterson, well, when Lee was convicted in the second trial, he, of course, appealed it. It's a capital offense. Appeal is, I think, automatic. And Patterson was ordered by the court to transcribe the testimony portion of the second trial for Lee's appeal. We don't have the transcript, but it's almost certainly the transcript that shows up in Lee's autobiography, Mormonism Unveiled. Now, Rogerson was ever resourceful. Either he had a longhand copy or he opened the book and started typing. But he typed out of what's in Mormonism Unveiled, including the summary comments, omitting what they omitted, and sold it to the church as his transcript for the second trial. Patterson's shorthand, he did not transcribe the rest of it. He died, and his shorthand is PS in the matrix. It is harder to read than Rogerson's, except when Rogerson wrote on top of his. The third person is Judge Borman. He was the judge for both trials. After Lee's execution, he decided to make a lot of money. He wanted the trial transcripts, the shorthand transcribed, and he was going to publish them. He hired Patterson's only student, named Waddington Cook, to transcribe Patterson's shorthand. Well, according to Rogerson, Cook hired him to help and asked Rogerson to bring his own shorthand, which is easier to read than Patterson's. I'll attest for that one. So they worked together, and the documents themselves support Rogerson's assertion that he helped. This is called BT, or the Borman transcript. They made a carbon copy. Borman's son sold the original to the Huntington Library. In 1946, 1945, Waddington Cook donated the carbon copy to the Library of Congress, with one exception. It's missing Baskin's closing from the first trial. Rogerson took that and sold it to the church as his original work. Rogerson's transcript is not to be trusted. So they worked. The Borman transcript, which Cook and Rogerson worked on together, is really, when you look at the columns, much of it is a fairly accurate transcript of the Rogerson shorthand. And if all this is complex, my introduction, which is about 30 pages of this, is either online or it's in the book. It's page 730 is part of that. So those of you who have the book, you can see all the arrows for all the sources. It came from the shorthand. It came from their imagination. It came from published sources. Parts of the shorthand were copied into each other. They copied parts of the transcripts from each other. There's all these different sources that went into making these transcripts at the time. This, of course, Cook's name begs the question, did Cook cook the books? Or did Rogerson cook Cook's books? And the real answer, they were both involved in cooking the books. There are times when Cook would take a correct transcript and cross it out and make it an incorrect transcript, which George D. Watt also did. And Rogerson did everything with a great deal of creativity. So for research, the transcripts are not reliable if they differ from the shorthand. So when you look at the matrix online at mountainmeadowsmassacre.org, the columns labeled RT and BT are the transcripts. And where they do not agree with the shorthand, they are very, very suspect. They probably came from somebody else's imagination. Rogerson was also the telegraph operator. And it was his job to send reports to the Salt Lake Tribune. So Fielding's book about all the reports in Salt Lake Tribune, that went through Rogerson. Steve Soren was often mad when we discovered that. Rogerson had his finger in so many different ways, and his work is not trustworthy. I worked mostly on this for several years, and then gradually branched out and started working on George Watt's shorthand and other things, and have come back to this. This hit home was hard. I started working on it in May, and in August, Steve Sorensen drove up to Logan to see me, and he walked in the door, and the first thing he said to me is, "Are you having nightmares?" And I don't think I was having nightmares yet, but I developed PTSD working on this. And I'm still struggling with it. I'm still under professional help for it. So I have asked that tonight in our questions, we have 2 question sessions. I realize with the expertise here, Rick and Janiece, that there'll be questions about the massacre. But I have requested we have questions about the book first, about the trial transcripts, the book, the legal process, and then I'll just step out in the hall out of earshot and you can ask questions about the massacre. So if we could please just, I don't want to be rewounded, I just can't handle any more of this than I have to. So, thank you. Are we open for questions now?
Yeah.
How do we handle the microphone for questions?
I can speak louder.
Go ahead.
I have 2 questions. First, who employed the prosecutor in both trials? Was it a state prosecutor, a county prosecutor?
Federal.
Federal? It's a federal.
So at the
Okay.
time, they were territorial courts, so there was
Okay.
not yet a state.
Okay.
Territorial
That's right.
courts are a little bit hard to describe to modern day people because territorial officers are appointed by Washington. So to that extent, they're federal, but the particular cases that they adjudicate can be either federal matters or what today we would call state matters.
So similar to a federal district court.
It's similar to a federal district court in that they're appointed, but unlike in a federal district court today, you'd have to do there would have to be something that would give it federal jurisdiction.
Right.
Murder, which is the main crime being prosecuted in this case, murder was not a federal offense at the time, and to this date there aren't a lot of federal murder statutes. If you committed murder today, that's largely a local crime. It can be taken into federal jurisdiction depending upon the circumstances. If you cross state lines, for example, and there are some statutes that relate to taking another's life in the federal realm. It's a complicated sort of thing. So when you say who employed them, they were territorial prosecutors who were working in a court that was overseen by the federal government and dealt with both federal and local issues.
Rick, would you mind repeating the questions as from now on?
Sure, happy
Yeah,
to.
thanks.
The question there was who employed the prosecutors? Great.
This is not about Mountain Massacre, but when you mentioned reading a journal in Deseret alphabet, I was wondering how many journals are you aware of that people used the Deseret alphabet, and in what period of time were they written?
The Deseret alphabet was developed in the early 1850s.
Yeah.
It rather died. The books were published in ~69. After Brigham Young's death, it died. Any of you who have tried to read it is very difficult to read, especially when you get to Martineau's Cursive Deseret. I don't know of many. There are some. When I was 11, I decreed I was going to be a Deseret transcriber when I grew up. When I was 22, I was a broke graduate student looking for work and asked the BYU librarian, Dennis Rowley, if he had any Deseret. He said no, but if I learned Pitman, he'd give me a job. And so, but there aren't many,
So
and
there's
this
not
was
many.
just part of it in Deseret. Yeah, my career was short-lived in Deseret. Well, they kept the church historian's office in Deseret for several months. It's got some good stuff in it too.
So you have all these different versions that are suspect, but were you able to get what you think is an accurate by going through all of these
On the
shade-
trial,
on the trial transcripts and shorthand?
the shorthand is the closest we have to a verbatim record. So if you're studying what happened and you want information about what happened, read the shorthand. And you will find that often they're alike. In Annie Hoke's testimony, there's one phrase, she said the Indians said they weren't going to do the damn dirty work alone. And Rogerson got damn dirty and Patterson picked up dirty work because she talked fast, so they both had part of it. If you put the two shorthand documents together, you have the best record of what was said.
And this is the reason that we set them up in a matrix of parallel columns so that you can easily, which also necessitates a lot of pages, but so you can easily see which source, which phrase comes from which source, and do that comparison on your own.
And Janiece had the job of putting it into parallel columns, and whenever I change a word, her patience is.
This is why we have all the other documents, because I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life.
But I mean, it's 20 years past the event, or 18, and by this time, I'm just curious about what Rogerson's motivation was for being such a liar. Do we know? I mean, was it by this time? Is it like the, you know, it's like a big social event, and so everybody's interested, and so everybody's planning on publishing something, and the juicier it is, the better.
The question is, why was Rogerson such a liar? I think he was several motivations. And it's tricky whenever we talk about people's motivations because we don't really know. But in part of the trial, he protected John D. Lee. And in part of the trial, he inserted material that indicted John D. Lee. There's some evidence that he was writing things that he thought the Mormon Church would want to buy. That if he made it juicy enough, they'd buy it and hide it. So there was some self-interest in that. There's no evidence that he intended to publish it at all. He was paid a small sum for the Mormon transcript. He might have been paid more if it had been published. But he's irregular in what he does. And so it's not possible to come down with an absolutely clean motivation. Accuracy in those days just isn't what it is today. And with George Watt too. I mean, our idea of accuracy just didn't exist then. And they were living, of course, in their times and acting on their own ideas of the importance of accuracy. But he did have motivations. It's come apparent in his letters that he had motivation.
And I might add, Rogerson's not the only one with motivations here. There are monetary considerations across the board. This is the whole reason that Borman wants the transcript, because he wants to publish it. Rick talked a little bit about Lee's confessions, and Bishop, this is how he's getting paid for all of the legal work and all of the effort that he's put in. And so we have suspect motivations everywhere in dealing with. I kind of, as LaJean and I have a long history of me playing devil's advocate for Rogerson. Just to try and critique some of the analysis, but it's a consistent game we play. We enjoy it.
So the shorthand was supposedly made during the trial.
Yes,
Okay. so
there's
it's
no
been
reason to
temp-
doubt that.
And the transcripts were compiled, 8 years after?
In the early 1880s. The question is, when were the trial transcripts? In the early 1880s. I think they were finished 1883. So that would have been 7 years after the second trial. The last thing they did was Baston's closing for the first trial. That would have been 8 years later. So we cannot say, as people are constantly hounding me, that they remembered. And some of it's ambiguous. There's one phrase that could say 6 mules or 6 miles, or these mules or those miles, or those mules and these miles. And I never did figure out exactly, because it could mean those things. And there's multiple meanings, so that's why you see the slash marks with multiple meanings there.
So what was the source material for the transcripts 7 years later? Was it memory or was it?
No, it's their shorthand. They had the shorthand in
They
front of
went
them.
with the shorthand too.
So Rogerson had his own shorthand. Then Cook had Patterson's shorthand, but he wrote to Rogerson to bring Rogerson's shorthand. So they had both shorthand. And the cross-contamination in the originals is obvious. They copied from one shorthand document into the other. And you can see the insertion marks. And in my introduction, which is online, you can find this information.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Who comes out as the, I guess, the most extraordinary personality from these notes, from these transcripts? I mean, who's the biggest character in all this, right?
Oh, there are so many characters. Should we each? So the question is, which character comes out as kind of the biggest character in all of this? And I suspect we each have probably a different vote. So maybe we could each give ours.
If you're talking about process making the transcripts, it's Rogerson. Because he fudged everything, every document. I say when I die, he's going to go running. I'm going to start forgiving. But I do owe him one thing. The thousands of hours I spent working on this, literally, with the transcript, though incorrect, is when I really learned how shorthand went together. And I found I could read George Watt's shorthand. I could figure it out before, but then I could read it. So I do owe him a debt, despite all my...
I perhaps would pick Robert Baskin as a central figure. Baskin shows up just on the eve of Lee's first trial. He has just been appointed as an assistant U.S. attorney, but he very quickly becomes the one who is arguing the case. Baskin's, well, Carey is the U.S. attorney, but seems to pale, withers a little bit when Baskin is around. And Baskin is the one who has kind of the legal vision. He has the vision that he wants to be able to pin the massacre on Brigham Young. And he crafts this trial around that. Now, though it ends in a hung jury, Lee's first trial ends in a hung jury, he effectively makes the case in the press. And very quickly, the narrative that's told about the massacre shifts to the point when Brigham Young dies in 1877. You have a majority of obituaries which will say Brigham Young ordered the massacre. Baskin never says that precisely in his argument, but the way that he has crafted the argument changes the whole narrative, the whole popular narrative of how this story is told. He also creates, so we have individual indictments for all 9. Then the first day of the trial, they come together with a joint indictment. And the defense attorneys have never seen this joint indictment before. And that is Baskin who crafts that and then later stamps a September of 1874 date on it, though it was created in July of 1875.
So we've heard about a court reporter, a lawyer. I'm going to talk about a witness. The desire of the prosecution from the beginning was to try to prosecute what they saw as a conspiracy. And it's the common approach when you're prosecuting a conspiracy to find a small fish to testify against a large fish. They very quickly had 2 people in custody, William Dame and John D. Lee. William Dame was the highest military official in southern Utah at the time. And if you've read Massacre Mountain Meadows, you'll see that he was basically the person who gave the final go-ahead on the massacre. So he was extraordinarily culpable, but at the same time, he had hidden his tracks pretty well. And so what they really wanted to do is they wanted to use Lee, who was in custody, to try to prosecute Dame. But Dame had covered his tracks really well, and Lee, who was given the chance to turn state's evidence, created a confession that they didn't think was sufficient. And so they immediately drop Lee, use the evidence he's given them, and turn on him. He felt betrayed, his lawyer felt betrayed. But that's the reason that Dame didn't end up there, because they didn't have the evidence on him. And ultimately, they released Dame for lack of sufficient evidence. So in the absence of Lee being a good witness, they had one other Well, they actually captured multiple people who were indicted, and one of those that they captured was Philip Klingensmith, who had played a significant role in the massacre and had early on agreed to turn state's evidence. So when it came time for the trial, they arrested him and brought him into town, and he was a star witness in the first trial. So as you're reading the events about the trial, he really becomes the key witness because he's a participant, and he's telling the story. But as with all the witnesses, he has his own motive. He's telling the story, and he tries to display himself as a humanitarian. Yes, he says under pressure, he fired his gun. Yes, probably killed somebody, he says under pressure. But basically he tries to portray himself as a humanitarian who goes around afterwards, picks up the surviving children, and carries them to safety and eventual adoption into good homes. So even Philip Klingensmith has a motive that's driving what he says, yet his testimony at times can be fairly dramatic.
Can I add one more little piece of drama? When Klingensmith is testifying in 1875, he is grasping a piece of paper which was the promise he had of immunity from George Bates, who had been the U.S. Attorney in 1871 when Klingensmith gave his original affidavit, but at this point was one of the defense attorneys. And he is clasping to that little piece of paper promising him immunity because he is not sure that he's going to get it.
And he wore a Bowie knife in his boots when he was in court testifying. And Rogerson wrote that when he was asked for his name, he yelled it out, that he acted like he was quite excited there. This got to Rogerson too. On the top of one of his pages of shorthand, he wrote, "Killing, killing, killing was done." It was hard on him too. One of the lawyers insisted that something happened on September 31st. It's right there. I don't know why they got September 31st. The calendar wasn't that much different.
Gary?
Rick, this is for you.
Okay.
What's your opinion of Lee's legal representation?
So the question was, what's my opinion of Lee's legal representation? I'm a trained lawyer, and as I look at his representation, I have a couple of thoughts. One of those thoughts is that he did manage to attract lawyers. His case was a big case, and as often happens in the defense law world, defense lawyers want prominent clients who make headlines and can help catapult the defense lawyer to attention. His very first lawyer, the person who approached him, was someone at the U.S. military camp in Beaver. And unfortunately, he got some type of disease and died in short order. So they had a funeral for him. The second person to approach him as a lawyer was a former Salt Lake Tribune reporter / miner / jack of all trades, sometime lawyer, who approached him and basically said, "I'll be your lawyer and your friend and represent you." Ultimately, he ends up with a whole team of lawyers, and there's actually some fairly good talent on the legal team. So initially, I think he's got fair representation. But by the time he gets to the end of his life, and he's had the first trial, and it's a hung jury, and the second trial, and he's convicted, then there's an opportunity for his conviction to be appealed, and there are some reasons why a good lawyer would have appealed his conviction, some technical issues. One of them is this affidavit that was mentioned. Baskin comes in with an affidavit claiming it was made, or excuse me, an indictment, which he claims was done many months before it actually was. And that by itself could have led to an appeal and overturning. But ultimately what happens is Bishop, who's his last remaining lawyer, ends up with a defense before the Utah Supreme Court. Utah Supreme Court affirms, and just for your information, you'll find this interesting today, the Utah Supreme Court, territorial Supreme Court in those days, was made up of the 3 district court judges, including the trial judge. So the activities, the behavior of the trial judge was appealed to the trial judge and his 2 fellow judges. Okay. So there it was confirmed, and there was an opportunity then to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the judge basically wrote to John D. Lee and said, "I'm not doing this for free, give me money so I can take it to the U.S. Supreme Court." Lee asked his family members, they weren't able to come up with it, and so then his lawyer wrote to him and said, "Sorry, we weren't able to do that, but let's just let bygones be bygones. I want your manuscript so I can get my fees." So towards the end, it felt quite callous to me on the part of his lawyer to be more interested in his legal fees than he was in the ultimate destiny of his client. Other questions?
What would you say is the most important information that was obtained from being able to read the shorthand versus?
That was your field. I read it, but I don't know what's more important than others.
So the question was, what's the most important information that came from reading the shorthand
Right, it wasn't contained.
that wasn't contained in the transcripts? My answer is actually a little bit more of an emotional answer than it is a factual answer. There are plenty of areas where there are changes and differences or omissions and subtractions. For me, the greatest change or the greatest contribution was to be able to look at the shorthand and see something in which I was confident. Looking at the transcripts, I could read something, and then I'd say to myself, being someone who pays a lot of attention to evidence, that's very interesting, but I have no idea if it's true. Looking at the shorthand that LaJean transcribed, I could say, well, that was taken during the proceedings in real time. That's very likely true. So it's a matter of being able to have a reliable source. Anybody else want to comment?
And I would just add to that, yeah, I think the trust, having the confidence in these sources is the biggest thing. We have shifts in the narrative, we have some slight shifts, but I think this also pointed to us, because a lot of work had been done on Mountain Meadows, not a lot of work had been done on the prosecution or Lee's trials, and most of the assumptions that people had made about Lee and his two trials are really off. But understanding just how limited the sources that people had been relying on for a really long time, we began to understand just how limited and those sources were. That we could not tell those stories with the sources that had been consistently used because they did not demonstrate the whole of what was going on, with Lee's trials particularly, but the whole of the prosecution.
I will say, particularly where we have two shorthand reporters working independently in the court, and it stretches the imagination that they would have time while they're taking shorthand to confer with each other and agree to fetch it. We have two shorthand records where they agree with each other. Then there's a very high level of reliability. Also, there's a lot of preliminary legal material, one of the closing arguments, some of the other material that was just never transcribed. And Rogerson and Patterson, Cook, got frustrated with Patterson's shorthand, where they only had Patterson's shorthand and they just simply omitted material. So there was a lot of material that was never available before in any form.
Did John D. Lee and Brigham Young, what was their relationship at the end of John D. Lee's life or Brigham Young? Did they ever make peace or?
Lee never gave Brigham up.
Repeated.
Oh, the question is, what was the status of John D. Lee's relationship with Brigham Young at the end of his life? And I think that, I'll just mention two things. One, I think often we hear quoted that Lee was the adopted son of Brigham Young. We of course have to remember the context of adoptions. The beginning in the 1840s, along with polygamy, we are adopting sons into families. So this is not the level of a relationship that perhaps an adopted son would have today. Lee gets very frustrated with Brigham and feels like Brigham has deserted him. But up until literally his last breath, he is given an opportunity to turn on Brigham. And he does not do that. He does not take advantage. You have the U.S. attorneys at the execution site who are telling him that they can help him if he will turn on Brigham, if he will pin this on Brigham, and he will not. He doesn't do that.
How about Brigham towards John D. Lee?
Despite his frustration, despite his really how upset he is with Brigham.
And you'll see more of this in our second narrative volume that Barbara and I are working on. John D. Lee has a theological reason for behaving the way that he does. When he ends up participating in the Mountain Meadows Massacre, he, unlike some other participants, the night of the massacre, lays out his blanket and sleeps like a baby. Now, if you ask yourself, if you were involved in something horrific, would you sleep that night? I know, I have a hard enough time sleeping the way it is, but if I had even witnessed something like that, I'm not sure I could sleep a wink. Well, he did, and you ask yourself, how can a person be involved in that type of horrific activity and then just sleep like a baby? He had a justification in his own mind for why he did what he did. It was essentially the Nuremberg, response that I was just following orders. So much during the latter part of his life, he would justify what he did on the grounds that he had no malice. For those of you who may be lawyers, you know that to commit murder, you have to have what the law calls malice. Killing somebody by itself is not murder. There are different types of killing. It can be self-defense and therefore justifiable. It can be other types of homicide like manslaughter or second-degree murder, first-degree murder. And so Lee constantly told himself and others, I had no evil motive here. So in his mind, he was not a murderer because he had no evil motive. That was his justification. So when it came time to have the opportunity to turn on Brigham Young and turn Brigham Young in, there is a moment that we'll detail in another book where he thinks about it quite seriously. He's been in jail a long time. Financially, he's struggling, so is his family, and he gets an opportunity, an offer to sort of turn against Brigham Young and then go out on a lecture tour. And for a moment, he thinks very, very seriously about it. And then as he ponders it, he decides, no, I will not do that. I will not turn in an innocent person, because if he does, then this earlier justification he has for why he's not a murderer doesn't hold, because now he takes an innocent person and he becomes responsible for that person's death. That makes him a murderer. So hence, to the end of his life, he refuses to take advantage of an opportunity to turn on Brigham Young and say that he was a murderer himself.
So what about Brigham Young, though, to John D. Lee?
Brigham Young's attitude towards John D. Lee is actually somewhat spotty from the winter quarters time period on. John D. Lee leads a very enthusiastic life, I will say. And whatever he does to a high degree and often to excess and even extremism. That got him into troubles in winter quarters. And so subsequently, Brigham Young saw him as a strong personality, and I think he probably felt like he's best out on the frontier. It takes a lot of energy, a lot of drive, somebody who has motivation, doesn't get discouraged. I think that's why he put him out there on the frontier where he was. But particularly after a certain period of time, when he feels that John D. Lee's story of the massacre to him was a incomplete story, a lie, he becomes upset at him. In the last part of his life, his basic feeling is, let's let the law take its course. And that's why John D. Lee was mad at him. John D. Lee thought somehow or another, with their earlier connections, that Brigham Young would do everything he could to protect him. And in fact, at the end, Brigham Young says, no, let's just let the law take its course. Yes?
Sorry, this is mundane. Tell me about the website. Do you have all 3,600 pages posted? And does the church history department sponsor this website, or is it a private thing?
The church history department does not sponsor the website. The address is mountainmeadowsmassacre.org.
Right.
We have on there, so to have the complete account, you need both of these volumes plus the website. What's on the website is largely what we couldn't fit into here, although LaJean's introduction has to be in both places because it relates to both sets of materials. The website essentially has on it these parallel columns, and I'll let my co-editors talk more about those.
The website, so the 3,800 pages that we referenced is the trial transcripts, parallel columns comparing all of those versions. And that is available in full on the website, including LaJean's introduction, which is also published in the published volumes, so that there is direct access to that and the key for transcription, so you can understand our transcription process and those very lengthy trial transcripts.
Does it include the actual pages of the shorthand, so the images?
No, there's one page on there.
Not that it would help any of us to have the original pages.
Believe me, there's one page illustrated there. When we put them in order, we put the Borman transcript between the two shorthands. So you can read down the Borman transcript and you have a passage, you can see which shorthand it came from. Sometimes both, but it's very interesting to see how the Borman transcript was. Then we have the Rogerson transcript is on the other side of Rogerson's shorthand, so you can compare the two and see what I'm talking about.
Thank you.
So if I might just summarize what historians believed before we did this and what we believe now. Beforehand, they assumed that Borman's transcript was a pretty accurate transcript and that it was made by Adam Patterson or his student, right?
By his student, I don't know.
I think the assumption was that it was Patterson, wasn't it?
Yeah, depending upon who you talk, which historians you talk to. So there was a general assumption. You had this court reporter with no vested interest in changing anything. You had the judge then ask him to transcribe it, and he did that faithfully. That was the original assumption. Now what we know is that that transcript, thought previously to be the more reliable of the two, the other one being Rogerson's transcript, is really a hodgepodge made up of the complicated combination of materials that LaJean has described for you. So neither one of those is particularly reliable. You really need to go to LaJean's transcription of the original shorthand to get what's the most reliable information.
And as for also the other volumes, the prior knowledge has always had this rotating around those two trials with Lee. And the more that we got into it, the more we realized there is a lot more that is going on. Lee was not the only one who was prosecuted. Lee is not the only one that they spent time on. And even after Lee's execution, it does continue for a significant amount of time. And so this narrative complicates exponentially the more that you get into the whole of the prosecution.
So what you see in the books is you see efforts to prosecute all 9 of the people who were indicted. This was group violence. This was a mass killing. And after John D. Lee's death in particular, it was very easy for other people who played a role in the massacre to simply point to John D. Lee and say it was all about him. In fact, what you'll see by looking at the books and the indictments and so on is that this was a group event, group killing. Did you want one more question?
So I had a question. These pioneers from Arkansas, when they were coming through Utah, I understood that Brigham Young told the Utahns not to give them any supplies. So they came through the Salt Lake Valley and they couldn't resupply their stock. It was one of the richest pioneer travelers coming through. And then they get killed down in southern Utah.
Okay, so this is the question. The question is, I understand that the Arkansas pioneers who came through Utah were among the richest trains to come through, and that Brigham Young had given instructions not to give supplies to these people, so they came through and weren't able to get the needed supplies. So let me deal with the components of that as I just restated it. The statement that it was one of the richest companies ever to cross the plains comes from a document that has, again, some difficulties. It's one of the primary documents used in the Mountain Meadows case. That assumption is based on a view of the train on the northern, or what today we would call Oregon-California Mormon Pioneer Trail, that essentially went from northwestern Missouri or southwestern Iowa across Nebraska following the Platte River, and then eventually up along the Sweetwater and down into Utah. In fact, our research shows that the majority of the pioneers from northwestern Arkansas followed a route you would expect for pioneers from northwestern Arkansas. They instead took the Cherokee Trail to Bent's Fort, and then along the east side of the Rockies through Cherry Creek, which is now Denver, then joined up with that northern trail, and then came back down through. So a description of them on the northern trail isn't going to hold very well. Now that being said, we went to tremendous efforts in Massacre at Mountain Meadows to try to quantify exactly how much wealth the company had. So we have an appendix in the book here in which we accumulate all of the known evidence about the property owned by that company. And it is a substantial amount of property. It is a wealthy train, no question. As far as the question about Brigham Young directing that supplies not be sold, that is true. Brigham Young, beginning in the very early 1850s, gave talk after talk, as did some of his fellow leaders, to Latter-day Saints in Utah about not selling, particularly their grain, to people who were coming through the territory at the time. The original pioneers who arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, it wasn't just that original pioneer company, there were waves of pioneers who came in. And that first year, many of them nearly starved to death through the winter because they ran out of food. And so when Brigham Young, who had gone back to the Midwest, returned to what became Utah Territory, at that point didn't have a name, but they were calling it Deseret. When he arrived in the valley and found out that these people had nearly starved, he became very committed to this idea of saving our food and not sharing it with outsiders, because he feared that the day would come again when there'd be some type of famine in the land and people would need it. So he began preaching, beginning in the early 1850s, about don't sell your grain to people coming through. Don't trade this important food source for clothing or for baubles that you don't really need. Store your food. This was really the huge emphasis on food storage that we continue to hear today. Actually, though, as people came through and had things that local people wanted, they saw it as an opportunity to buy something that otherwise was not available to them, and they often did trade, which led to more statements from him. So when the Utah War began, the rhetoric about saving food just upped. And the people who remained in Utah were told, don't sell your guns, don't sell your ammunition, and don't sell your food, because we might need all of those in a protracted war or a siege. So in fact, when the company came through, they included people like Alexander Fancher, who had come through Utah before. He was interested in establishing a cattle business that would continually drive cattle through Utah. And on his early trips through, he was able to buy supplies. So when he came through during the Utah War, he found a different scenario. And it was disappointing to those pioneers who came through. They weren't able to buy the supplies that they needed.
Let's give him a hand.